And this, of course, the ceasefire seems to be one of the points that has actually led this to happen. Coming back to the Lebanon and Israel ceasefire, when this was announced, it looked like Israeli Prime Minister was in a cabinet meeting with his VAR officials, and it seemed like it was a very, it seemed like, of course, there was no consultation as such with Netanyahu. How do you see Netanyahu's reaction, and what do you think does this ceasefire mean for Netanyahu?
Well, I can't speak, of course, to whether or not there was a consultation, but it at least seems as though he's speaking from a diplomatic perspective right now, saying that he's willing and able to meet with the president of Lebanon. So that is something that we have not necessarily seen, at least in recent times, and it could be a potentially historic event. He's towing the line here, and it seems as though he has had subsequent conversations with the U.S. and is willing and able to at least move forward to some degree. But again, as we mentioned, that this is going to be a step-by-step process, and it's going to take a lot of resolve on all sides and a willingness to compromise in order for us to move forward.
Absolutely. And while that remains the baseline, we understand that the agreement is technically between Israel and the Lebanese state. But again, if we are treading with caution, it is pertinent to us that the conflict essentially on the ground has been between Israel and Hezbollah, and now with the non-state actor without it being directly involved in the agreement. It makes you question how viable is the ceasefire going to be?
It's a fair point. We can, ascertain that if the Lebanese government agrees to some parts of this, then they're going to be able to have some type of influence over Hezbollah in order to ensure that the ceasefire that has been brokered or any agreement that's been brokered is not going to be violated. So, again, it's a fair question. And on Israel's side, they're going to have to be in a position to take the Lebanese government at its word and believe that they're able and willing to hold Hezbollah accountable should some type of action take place that violates any type of agreement. So it's a step-by-step, slow-moving process, but it sounds as though the parties are at least in a position to begin some type of solid negotiations, and we can see from there what actually takes place.
Also, when it comes to the Iran-U.S. negotiations, Donald Trump has now claimed that Iran has now agreed to hand over its enriched uranium that is now underground, as he's described it. According to U.S., they had proposed a 20-year stop to its nuclear program. According to Iran, they wanted it to be 5 years. There seems to be, of course, again, the sticking point there, coming back to the talks that happened even before the 12-day war in June last year. So it seems like they're back to square one. How do you analyze those talks going forward when Iran is clearly adamant about, not really saying that it's not for a nuclear weapon, it's for civilian purposes?
Yeah, again, it's interesting because there's a world in which we may come back to some of the broad strokes or some of the main key points of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action brokered under President Obama that ensured that there was no nuclear weapon in Iran, and it still provided some opportunities for them to use it to continue some civilian programs with the proper oversight. And that's very well what we may end up back to, as you mentioned, being back at square one. And should that be the case, it really begs the question, well, what was, the necessity in any of this conflict and strife to begin with? So it's going to be interesting to see what is actually agreed to in order to close this continuous gap right now that we're seeing regarding the terms of any agreement.
Absolutely. And having said that, of course, this Lebanon-Israel deal, it has a direct influence on what is going to happen with Washington and Iran. And we've also seen Israel carry out with a certain amount of strategic autonomy, even though it says that it's completely aligned with the goals as the United States. But do you think it's also contingent on how far Israel is willing to go to restrain its appetite for, going on with the conflict and actually showing the same level of restraint that Washington requires out of them to make this deal any different than what happened the last time?
Yeah, I think absolutely that Israel and the United States are going to have to maintain strong communications and be lock in step on this one. Israel's not going to be able to be in a more autonomous position as they have been previously if because of the conditions relying from Israel and Lebanon on the U.S. Iran deal. So I believe we will see a bit more restraint there. We'll see a lot of communication. We'll see a lot of the types, or we should see a lot of the types of statements that were made previously today from Benjamin Netanyahu and from President Trump, where it sounds as though they are very much aligned in the way that they want to move forward diplomatically. So I can't stress enough how fragile this is and how much you cannot have anyone acting as an outlier if you're going to have any type of lasting agreement here that really takes place.
And in terms of diplomacy, how does the decision impact Netanyahu back home when it comes to domestic issues politically?
Well, I think that remains to be seen. It really depends on what the ultimate terms of any agreement is. We know that he's been somewhat unpopular at times in the past domestically, and that has played no small part in some of his political decisions. It's going to be interesting to see how the Israeli people ultimately take this. It would appear from polling, and it appears from a lot of their own comments, that the vast majority do not want to be in a conflict, and no one wants to be in a long-standing locked conflict. And Israel has had actions taking place within the region with various governments, with various autonomous groups. So it would seem as though everyone is ready to find a way to a lasting peace in this, to include the Israeli people, and that is going to likely play a role domestically, a large one for President Netanyahu, or Prime Minister, excuse me.
Right. All right, of course. Well, a lot of sticking points, a lot of tension there. But yeah, well, we would still see this ceasefire as a very positive outcome of some negotiations going on. But thank you so much, Mr. Garrison, for joining us and giving your perspective and enlightening us all the details. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.